Today's daf is daf Samach Gimel. Let's just review that which we need from the previous Amud as an introduction to Samach Gimel. The Gemara related that in the household of Rav Yanai, and apparently Rav Yanai gave his okay, they had a certain tradition with regard to Shemitah. What did they do? They wanted to purchase the produce of the Aniyim towards the end of the year of Shemitah, because once the time for Biur Shvius would come about, then the Aniyim would be stuck with Shvius that's basically worthless. So they reached out, so to speak, to the Aniyim, and they would purchase that Shemitah in a way that the Aniyim, the poor people, could collect from a storekeeper, which is called a Chenvani, and the Baal Bayis would pay the storekeeper, and that would take place on the 8th year after Shemitah, so that the Aniyim would now receive non-Shemitah produce. So that was the goal of this arrangement. And the question came in front of Rabbi Yochanan whether or not this was permissible. And the problem is that since the payment of the Baal Bayis to the storekeeper is in exchange for the Shemitah produce, therefore the the payment itself would have the status of what's called chalipe shvius. It would take on the status of Shemitah. Rabbi Yochanan said it was okay, and the reason he permitted it is because the Shemitah produce was already consumed, meaning by the time the members of Rav Yanai's household would repay the poor people for the Shemitah produce that they bought, that produce was no longer in existence. And therefore, that which is paid for these fruits and grains and Shemitah produce does not get the status of Shemitah, because a replacement does not acquire Shemitah sanctity if by the time that replacement and that exchange takes place, the Shemitah product is already gone. So let's begin our daf, Samach Gimel, and hopefully things will clear up as we go along. The Gemara quotes a brisa with regard to Esnan Zona. This is the last thing we touched on yesterday. And the brisa has two cases in which the Isser of Esnan Zona, which is an animal paid for the cohabitation with a harlot, would not apply. One is because the animal was given to the prostitute before the cohabitation, and the other is because the animal was given later on after the cohabitation. So the Gemara now on the top of our Amud asks the following question. In the case where he gave her the animal before the cohabitation, later on, when he cohabits with her, lecho ola iser esnan lemafreya. Why don't we say that now that he is paying her for the cohabitation, lemafreya, retroactively, she acquired ownership over that animal at the time of the cohabitation, and that makes it into esnan. So the Gemara, in order to get out of this problem, invokes an interpretation of Rabbi Eliezer, and according to that interpretation, according to Girsa's Rabbi Lazar, is kisha kadma v'krivatu, where let's call time T1, T2, T3. At time T1, there was the cohabitation with the prostitute. At time T3, he presents her with the animal. But in between, just one second. Just want to say I'm missing, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. But let's get it straight. There's so many different cases in the Gemara. At time T1, he gave her the animal, not like I said before. And at time T3, he had beer with her. So the Gemara argues before Rabbi Lazar that when he gives her the animal at time T3, retroactively, she should acquire the animal at the time of time T1, at the time of the cohabitation. That would make it Esnan Zona, it should be also Mizbeah. So the Gemara answers that at time T2, she took the animal that she had received at time T1 before the cohabitation, and she was makrivid on the Mizbeah. So in this case, we can't apply the principle of Lamafreya to prohibit this carbon because she already brought the carbon and he hadn't yet cohabitated with her. I mean, the only question is if she had already brought the carbon, so what's the discussion about? Apparently, the discussion would be whether she was Yotzei Hachiv carbon or not. Does she have to replace it with another carbon? Hechi Dami, Idi Amarla Knilach Me'achshav. He first at time T1 gave her the animal, and he told her, make a kinyan now and acquire it. So she already made a kinyan on the animal, then she brought it as a carbon. So the Gemara argues, Pshita Deshari, that's okay. She's bringing a carbon which cannot be considered esna because she hasn't yet even cohabitated with him. Cohabited. Do lesser b'shas bia. Right? She had already brought the carbon, beheter, and then when she has beer with him, the carbon has already been brought. It's already post facto. So if the carbon was already brought, then how did she acquire ownership over the animal at time T1 before she brought the carbon if it was given to her as a payment for the beer? It doesn't make sense. How could she acquire something? And the Gemara answers, Matana bi'almud. He actually gives her a matana. Now, again, if you ask me whether psychologically this is true, if we would ask him at time T1, why did you give her the animal? It's hard to believe he would say, I was giving her a gift. But al pidin, it becomes a matana. Because later on, when he has beer with her, that znus could not generate a kinyan l'mafreya. So the kinyan that she has to be b'toras matana. It can't be as a payment for the beer. The idolo amar la knilech me'achshav. The Gemara is saying, wait a minute, he gave it to her as a matana? Now you're telling me he didn't say to her, knilech me'achshav. But rather, his understanding was that her ownership of the animal would only be chal when he has beer with her. If that be the case, hechi motzi mekarva. Right? Ish ki Yaakov is beiso kodesh, omer achmano, ma beiso b'shusav kol b'shus. So you can't bring a carbon unless you own the animal. And that we learned from the Hekesh to Beiso. She couldn't even be Magdish, the animal, because it's not hers to be Magdish. She has no bilus over it. So we're in a Miman of Shach situation. No matter how you slice the cake, we're in trouble. If you're going to tell me that he gave it to her as a matana, and he said to her, Knilach me'achshav, then pshita. Then hands down, I mean, she could bring the carbon's kosher. I don't need to deal with that. Ella, what he didn't say to her, Knilach me'achshav, and therefore the implication is that she'll only own the animal when he has beer with her. Well, how could she have brought the carbon? Rabbi Loza says she brought the carbon and she was yotze and fulfilled her neder to bring the carbon. Now, by the way, this ma beso bershuso af kol bershuso really has nothing to do with this Gemara, technically. The case of ma beso bershuso af kol bershuso is a case where you own something, but it was stolen or it was lost, and then you want to be magdish it. So the halacha is that it's not enough that it's beso and you own it, but it's also got to be bershuso. It's got to be within your domain. Now it was stolen and you don't know where to find it. Can't be magdish. But our Gemara is using this almost as a kolshkein. How much more so if she doesn't own the animal? Because he didn't say tni loch me'achshav, and therefore he wants the kinyan that she acquires ownership of the animal to be valid only after the bia. So then, how could she have brought the carbon? Ella di Omar law, we have to find a case again with Zachidush. Lehevi gabech ad shas bia. V'i mitztarech lech knei me'achshav. In other words, I'm going to pay you in cold cash for the cohabitation. But in the meantime, you take this animal, and if by any chance you need the animal, then you'll accept the animal as payment and I don't have to pay you. If you don't need the animal, then I'll take the animal back and I'll pay you in cold cash. So now, since he's giving her the animal for the beer, for the znus, such that in event that she needs the animal, she could take the animal and receive it as payment. then we would have a havamina that maybe the animal has the status of an esnan zona, and it's also a mizbeach. Kamash malon, the Brisa teaches me no, because since she did not, just 1 second, since so again, why isn't it esnan now? Just 1 second. Whoa, is this complicated? You would need a great Rosh Hashiva to explain this Gemara. And it gets, by the way, much more complicated. This is just the easy part of the sugya. What's happening is the following. There's a Havamina and a Kamashmal and a Maskana. In the Havamina, since he said to her that if you want to accept this animal as payment for the cohabitation because you need the animal, in the Havmin, I would say, therefore, it's an Esnan Zona. She's definitely receiving the animal as payment for the future beer that's going to take place now or later. So what's the Kamash Malon? And what's the Maskana? He never said to her, I'm giving you this animal now, and you should acquire it now for the beer. That would certainly make it Esnan. But he only said it in a way that, if she needs the animal and she wants to take it, then it's payment for the beer. But he never actually said explicitly at the time that he gave her the animal that it's yours from now. He only gave her that option. So in the absence of saying to her those holy words that the animal is yours now, it's not an esnan zona, but rather it's a gift. No, if it's a gift, what was the havamina that the carbon would be possible? The answer is the havamina was that since she decided to cash in and take the animal because he gave her that option, it might be considered payment for the beer. And when she acquires it, it's an esnan, and then the carbon is possible. Kamashma, no, he's giving it to her as a gift. Boy Rav Oshia. Now, in the way the Gemara sets up the brisa, the time T2 in the middle is when she was makriv the carbon al gabi mizbech. So the Gemara asks, Ravashi asks the following, Hoshaya asks the following question: what happens if she didn't bring the carbon at time T2? She was only magdish the carbon, so she designated it with a neder, and she said, "This is a carbon." Keva di Omer Marami Russell Gvo Consiros Legikiman Diakriv to dummy. Now I'm trying to figure out, is the Gemara explaining the Havamina or the Maskana? Let's just see. Let's say it this way. What the Gemara is arguing now is that since he gave it to her for the purpose of bia as payment, so the question is, at what point does she acquire ownership over the animal? So right now, in the first side in Rav Hoshaya's suffix, he's going to argue that she should only become, that the flesh should only become payment for the Mises Nus at the time that the Mises Nus is actually implemented. And we're not going to be able to say that when they actually implemented Bia at time T3, then Lemafreya, she owned it from the time that he gave it to her, and therefore it's an Esnan Zona, and therefore it would be possible. No, we're not going to say that. We're going to say that there's no difference whether at time T2 she actually brought the carbon or at time T2 she was magdish the carbon, because that represents a complete kinyan. Kimasi Russell lehejotami. And therefore, since she had complete ownership over the animal before the Maisa Bia, it's not an Esnan. And we can't say Lumafreya became an Esnan because she already gave it to Hegdesh in between the two time periods. Oh, Dilma, what's the tzad to say that it is Asur and the carbon is Pasul? Hashtamia koi the Isa be'ene. When do we say it can't go lemafreya? That's when it's not be'en anymore, when it's been consumed. It's been brought on the mizbeach and turned into smoke. But here, that the animal is still in existence, then we could apply the principle of lemafreya and say that from the time he gave it to her, it was already an esnan zona, and therefore it's pasul mizbeach. So Gemara says, let's read Rabbi Elazar carefully, and from his language, we're going to prove one way or the other. Tifshot mi Rabbi Elazar, the Rabbi Elazar, shekadma vikravtu. That the reason why the carbon is kosher is because she already was makar of the carbon. The carbon was consumed on the mizbeach before the Mises Nus. And if we're careful about reading the language of Rabbi Elazar, it's dafka hikrivata avalik disha. Why didn't Rabbi Elazar tell me a greater chiddush? That the carbon is kosher, even if it wasn't brought on the mizbeach, just because she was magdashid and kimasi rasa lehejotomi. The Gemara says no, that's not a clear proof. Rabbi Elazar gufe kami boiler. Rabbi Elazar himself was in doubt as to what would be the din if she had been magdashid, but the animal was still extant. My. So mifshat pishita leila Rabbi Elazar, it was beyond a shadow of doubt in Rabbi Elazar's mind, dekrivatu dafka, that if she brought the carbon and it's already been consumed, the carbon is kosher. But he wasn't sure whether that's bedafka because she brought the carbon already, avalik disha so low, but maybe if she was only magdish, that's not enough. Da isa b'shas bia, because it's extant, it's alive, it's well, it's physically chai v'kaim at the time of the bia. O Dilma, or Rabbi Elazar saw it in a different way, and ikrivato pshitole vikdisho mesapkale, but it could be that Rabbi Elazar did not come to any conclusion, and he was not definite about the case of ikdisho, so he left it out because he wasn't certain about it. So basically, we're back to Rav Hoshaya's Iboilu, Teku. The Gemara leaves it as like so. Again, quickly, we're really pressured for time today. This is an incredibly complicated daf. The two tzadim in the Suffolk are the following. According to the first sad of Rabbi Lazar, the carbon is possible. Why? Because since the carbon is still extant at the time of the bia, it becomes l'mafreya esnan zona. According to the second possibility of Rabbi Lazar, which he was unsure about, then it's possible that the carbon is kosher. We can't say l'mafreya because kimasi rosso lehejodomi, and it's as if she had brought the carbon. Next. Baal Levi achar kach nosan lo. Again, the Bryce had two scenarios, if you recall. We've been focused on the scenario where he had bia first, and then, I'm sorry, where I keep making the same mistake over and over again, where he gave her the animal first and had bia later on. Now we go back to the other case in the Brisa, where he had bia up front, but he didn't yet pay her. And again, the Brisa says that it's not an esnan, it's mutter. So the Gemara says, Uraminu, I'm going to ask you a contradiction from another Brisa. Ba'oleh, v'akach nosan lo, afilu mikan v'ad sholosh shonim, esnana also. Even if 3 years went by between the Maisa Bia at time T1 and the actual giving over of the animal at time T3, 3 years had passed by, nevertheless the esnan is also. And presumably, again, it is a case where in the interim of those 3 years, she hadn't brought the carbon, so the carbon is still extant. So this is now a contradiction to everything that we said until now, that if the animal comes into possession after the bia, it's not an esnan. So now we start with Rav Chizda. I mean, Rav Chizda is not going to last too long, but let's understand Rav Chizda. Hadi Omar his bali li bitlez zev. Hadi Omar la his bali bitlez stam. So again, when he had bia with her, did he designate a specific animal and tell her that he's going to give her that animal as payment for the bia? That's the case of the last brisa, in which that animal, that tle, that lamb, becomes an esnan and it's possible mizbeach. Or did he just say, stam, you know what, I'll give you an animal? He didn't point to any animal. So now let's try to understand what's going on over here. In the case of the last brisa, his bali li bitle zen, he specifies the tle, she apparently acquires ownership at the time of the bia because he specified the tle. There's a problem here because, okay, let's say the tle is payment. Payment is called damim. So let's say you want to sell me metaltal, and you want to sell me a movable object, and I pay you for it. I didn't acquire ownership on it. I have to do what's called a mashicha. So the Gemara immediately asks, she didn't make a mashicha on the tle. He's got the tle in his possession. He designates and says, I'm going to pay you for the beer with that tle. But she hasn't made a mashicha on the tle. It's metaltalin, and metaltalin is not niknin without mashicha. And the Gemara answers, Bizona avodas kol chavim. She's a non-Jewish woman. The lokanya b'mashicha. What does it mean, lokanya b'mashicha? The Gemara formulates it in the negative, but it really means that a guy could be a kona, he could acquire ownership. In this case, a woman could acquire ownership through what? Through damim, through payment. So once he says tlez there, it has been designated as payment, and she's kona with damim, as if he paid her cash. Ibai saying, I want to go back to the original assumption that this is a non-Jewish prostitute, is a Jewish prostitute. Li'olam bezona Yisraelis. So now you're asking if he said tlezu, payment for the bia, she acquires ownership of it. There was no Mashiach. The answer is kigon dekoy b'chatzera. Where is the tle? It's not in his private property, but it's standing in her private property. So she has a gated field, and the Gemara Bava Metzia derives from psukim in the Parsha of Gittin that there's a kinyan called chatzer. So the moment that they consummate the bia, at that moment she's kona the tle in her chatzer. Gemara says, I don't get it. Meaning, if the Bryce is talking about a case where the tle is in chatzera, so then at the moment of bia, she acquires ownership of the payment through kinyan chatzer, and it should be an esnan. Why is it mutter? Lo tzricha de shavya niala apoteki. The Yomi imay sina lach zuzi mikan v'ad yom ploni mutter. V'lav shakli besnani. So now we get into another sugya, which is called apoteki. Apoteki means mipo tehe gvia. In other words, that the lova stipulates that this object is exclusively designated as like a security for the malva to collect his chov if the lova on this outstanding loan does not come up with the money. So that's called apoteki. So now he points to the tle. He's the lova because he owes her money, which he was mischayev for this bia. It's mamish a business transaction. And he designates it as an apoteki. Shom tehei, from here you'll collect your money. Now, I'm going to give myself a month or 2 months to pay you with cash. If I don't come up with the money by that date that we stipulated, then you collect this tle as an apoteki in payment for the chov that I owe you for the bia. And then it becomes esna. And why does it become esnan? Because the very moment that he designates this particular tle as an apoteki, she already acquires a kind of quasi-ownership over the tle. Even though, again, he has rights within the next month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever it is, to come up with the cash. Now, the language of the Brisa becomes very difficult. Right? The Brisa calls it Bal Lev Yachakach Nosan Law. Well, what do you mean Yachakach Nosan Law? He gave it to her up front at the time of the bia as an apoteki. But I guess the answer is, since he allowed himself the possibility of paying her with cash, she doesn't really know whether or not she has ownership over the tle. It's up in the air to be determined at some future time. Therefore, it's considered as if Nosan La Acharkach. After the bia, he gave it to her. Okay. Masi Rav Sheshes. Now, Rav Sheshes is going back to Rav Yanai and Rav Yochanan and raising the following objection from a Bryce. Omer Odom lechamorov ulepolav lechu ichlu bedinar zeh tzeu su bedinar zeh v'eno choshish. Okay, we have three people here in this scenario. We have the chamorim and the polim, the workers. We have the balabayis, who hires these workers, and he gives his workers a dinar, which is a significant amount of money, and he says to them, go take this dinar and spend it at the storekeeper and buy whatever you need with this dinar. And now the balabayis clears his hands, so to speak. Why? Because the workers now take that dinar and they will decide which storekeeper they will go into and where they will spend that dinar. And if that storekeeper is selling them one of three categories of Isur, which we'll see in just a second, that's not the problem of the balabayis. He's not going into the storekeeper and paying the storekeeper. It's the workers who decided to do so.